Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today I have with me my good friend Joshua Pillows. We are here to promote a wonderful resource that I will let Joshua explain. All this to say, I've made passing mention of it in previous videos, but it is entitled The Great Debate, Readings and Analyses. I think I've got that right. Joshua, why don't you tell us a little bit about really the motive behind the title? It sounds familiar. If people are familiar with Dr. Bonson's works, is that kind of a play off a different title from one of his other books, or was that something you kind of just came up with?
No, I think I don't know who came up with it or if it just germinated naturally. But on YouTube, the debates on YouTube, I think it has like hundreds of thousands of views,
Mm,
and it's titled "The Great Debate: Does God Exist?" So I don't know who came up with it, but the book title is "The Great Debate: Does God Exist? Reading and Analysis of the Bonson Stein Debate."
mm.
So I guess it came from that title, and it seems apt, appropriate, to because it was a great debate,
Yeah.
literally. So,
Well, I
um,
thought you got it from the Van Til's apologetic readings and analyses because you're following that same vein of offering kind of commentary. So I thought that was, I guess I was off. I thought that's where
yeah,
it was from.
in the Objective Proof of Christianity, my book from last year, that transcript was sent to Gary DeMar, and that it was he was the one who said, "Okay, I'm going to put it in book form, and let's add commentary as well," because that book, as you know, and for those of you who've read it, is really philosophical and pretty dense. So it was really a good call by Gary to say, "Okay, let's put commentary in by me, and especially by Bonson as well."
Right.
And because it's been such a great success and nothing but great reviews on it, towards the end of that production, he called me and said, "I want to do the Great Debate as well."
Mm.
And so we're going to do the exact same thing, get the transcript in book form, and then let's add commentary again, even though the debate is more practical, right? It's a back and forth. It's not a philosophy class or apologetics class. So, yeah, it was really Gary, I guess, who started this whole outlining of the books of transcript, commentary, keep going, commentary, just to elucidate and clarify the material and give more from Bonson and myself.
Yeah, excellent. Well, the Gordon Stein Bonson debate has been considered a classic in apologetic circles. I remember I went to an apologetics conference years back in New Jersey, and even then, when the speakers, they were not presuppositionalists, when they were, but the speakers there, after they got done speaking and they were kind of casually kind of talking, that debate came up. I mean, there was some controversy. Some people think that Dr. Bonson did not demonstrate the transcendental argument. Others thought that, they thought
Yeah.
it was a great, presentation of the transcendental argument for the existence of God. Why do you think this debate is considered a classic in apologetic circles today?
I think the principal or primary reason is that it utilized a completely different apologetic approach than all historic apologetics. It was presuppositional. And I remember when I heard it for the first time, and I was still a budding presuppositionalist. Dr. Bonson opened his opening statement. He said, "I'm arguing for Christian theism. I'm a
Mm.
Christian." And he was explicit. "I'm not being neutral," which is kind of like the common sense way is, okay, no biases. Let's start with a clean slate, right? And so one of the defining marks was it was distinctly Christian and it was distinctly presuppositional. It wasn't going to abstract philosophical concepts. It wasn't going to historic evidences. It was a solid um, commitment to God and His Word. So one of the reasons I think it has controversy is because that apologetic wasn't well known at the time,
Mm.
and of course now it's more well known 40 years later. But I think that was one of the defining reasons why it's memorable and it's kind of in the anthology, if you will, of apologetic debates.
Yeah, yeah. Now I hear that a lot from people. Like when we talk about this debate, many atheists that I've encountered will say, "Well, Greg Bonson did a good job because no one ever heard of the transcendental argument, so it makes sense that it threw, Gordon Stein off." But the argument really doesn't carry any weight. People don't take
Yeah.
transcendental arguments seriously, so on and so forth. How would you interact with someone who suggests that? Because it's true. A lot of people are familiar with the transcendental argument as typically put forth by lay presup apologists and so forth. So people are already acquainted with the language, the line of reasoning for the most part. There's obviously ridiculous amount of misrepresentation, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing. Just read the comments to many of my
Yes.
videos. They're really bad, and it's really tempting
Yeah.
to interact with some of them, but they're so bad
Yeah.
that I don't know what to do at this point. Just repeat myself, but Dr. Greg Bonson was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bonson U. Bonson U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bonson. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bonson U Plus and Bonson U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. At any rate,
Yeah.
what do you say to people who say the only reason why Dr. Bonson did well in that debate was because it caught Gordon Stein off guard? But, it can be easily responded to now that we kind of know and are familiar with this kind of argumentation.
Yeah, it's kind of a given that Dr. Stein was just completely unprepared. And David Hagopian, the moderator, if you read the book, we have 4 appendices, and so he's one of the we get a lot of information from him, and he's sitting behind both of them, and so he can see behind the table of both. And Dr. Stein has his flashcards with all of these arguments, but he didn't have the transcendental argument. He's shuffling through, and as time goes on, David, the moderator, sees he's getting flustered, and he's kind of realizing he's under a lot of pressure. So, yeah, one of the reasons is Dr. Stein was just so unready for the debate, and it really did a disservice to the transcendental argument that Bonson gave, because he had to keep going back to the same points, like the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, and induction,
Sure.
because it just was not clicking for Dr. Stein. And because of the having to keep going over the repeated points, it did a disservice to the transcendental argument, because Bonson could have definitely embellished upon it more.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a little bit in the question and answer session at the end of the debate. But I think that's one of the reasons why we get so many criticisms, is because it was kind of in a rudimentary illustration, because it couldn't go on. It couldn't go on because Dr. Stein didn't prepare for it. So now that you said it's been 40 years and more people in academia are well aware of it, because it wasn't laid out sufficiently, that makes it prone to just being attacked over and here and here and here. When if Dr. Stein had prepared, Dr. Bonson could have answered all of those objections, but because he was stuck, then we get those comments in your comment section. It's the same stuff. And so it's like, well, let's get my books out, because it's Bonson's material, and these are the embellishments upon the points he couldn't make in the debate. Right.
So what is the value of the book? Someone says, I've listened to the debate 100 times. What other things can be said about the main points that Dr. Bonson lays out? What will the person or how will a person benefit from purchasing this book as opposed to just kind of listening to the debate themselves?
Well, the short and simple answer is that it's an entire book is the embellishment of the transcendental argument. And of course, it goes into embellishing more of the faults and fallacies of Dr. Stein's points as well. But it makes up for or compensates for the lack of more illustration from the transcendental argument. So we have commentary, not just from myself, but from Bonson and all of his other works. And so, yeah, I would listen to the debate 100 times, and I like it, and people who don't like it. But the purpose of the book is to embellish upon the transcendental argument.
What do you mean by embellish? I've heard embellish as kind of like exaggeration, embellish a story. What do you mean by that?
Like fleshing it out, getting more of the details from it, like extracting from the main body of the argument itself.
Okay.
So it's as if Dr. Stein had prepared, and then Bonson responded with articulative points that should have been made to clear up more of the criticism. So it's one big fleshing out, if you will, embellishment, fleshing out.
And what else in the book is not available in other resources? I mean, I really love my favorite Bonson book now to date. It used to be Van Til's Apologetic Readings and Analyses, but it's such a massive book. It's very impractical for me to sit down and be like, I want to pick this up and plow through it. My favorite book now is The Objective Proof for Christianity. And that was the transcription and footnotes that I think a lot of that you offered on Dr. Bonson's series on transcendental argument. That's my favorite. I love it. But in that book, I highly recommend people pick it up at AmericanVision.org. It is my go-to. So I'm preparing for a debate with the atheist Dan Barker in February, and I have a bunch of books that I'll be using, but that one's one that I will be returning to often. So highly recommend folks check that particular book out. But in that particular book, Objective Proof for Christianity, you have an appendices, and you kind of tackle issues that I haven't seen in a lot of apologetic books. What have you added to, or is there anything added to this new book, The Great Debate, that people can look forward to, when they read it? They're like, oh, I've never seen this expounded upon or explained, and so forth.
It's kind of like a paradox, actually, because there are 4 appendices, and the first one is mine, and it's a synopsis of the debate as if Dr. Stein had prepared. And so if there's an opening statement by Bonson, and I draw from all of his works to make it as authentic as can be. And then there's a question and answer that's solely my words from what I've learned from Bonson. And then there's a Bonson rebuttal again from all of his works. But the paradox, if you will, is it's all the same points from the appendix in the Objective Proof for Christianity, but it's practically laid out for a layman, if you will. So there's nothing new, but there's also something new, if you will, in that it's explained differently than a philosopher's point, because the appendix in the Objective Proof for Christianity, I've never been to college, but that's what I consider my master's thesis. It's very long, it's very philosophical, but in this book, it addresses the same points, but from a practical perspective. So you're still getting new information, if you will. It's just reworded, rehashed out into more practical terms.
Very good. Now, what I really appreciated about the debate was how Dr. Bonson structured his opening statement. So I just recorded an analysis of Dr. Bonson's opening statement. It kind of dropped today. We're recording now, but that particular video dropped earlier today, where I kind of unpack Dr. Bonson's opening statement and expand upon various points, kind of like what you do in the book, but you have kind of a more knowledgeable basis in terms of providing analysis. I think you've listened to more of Dr. Bonson's lectures than I could ever dream. But I offered my kind of analysis there. But what I really appreciated was how Dr. Bonson structured his opening statement. Can you walk us through how he did that? What was his purpose in terms of laying out definitions and talking about the nature of evidence, and how can we use that in terms of practical application when we're engaging unbelievers, kind of having that outline in our mind? How is that helpful?
Yeah, it goes back to what I said about that defining mark, that he just comes right out of the gate. I'm a Christian. I'm unwavering. I'm arguing specifically for Christian theism. I'm not going to theism and then jumping to Christian theism. So his opening statement really started with underscoring that I'm not neutral. Dr. Stein's not neutral. Any evidence you give is just going to be thrown at him, and he's going to reinterpret it, and that's going to be thrown at me, and I'm going to reinterpret it. So he really makes it a defining point that he's being biased and Dr. Stein is being biased. We cannot be neutral when it comes to fundamental matters. If you want to talk about the rain, sure, you could judge if it's going to rain in an hour, and you could be, more or less neutral, but that's nothing close to foundational presupposition.
We're talking about paradigmatic level. And a lot of people don't get this. They kind of are so stuck in the details that they forget that the nature of our argument is kind of this broad worldview picture. So I find that interesting.
You can't escape it either. And so after he lays out in his opening statement that no one's neutral, he's not being neutral, Dr. Stein isn't, then, as is common in opening statements, he goes to Dr. Stein's works and exposes the fallacies of how he tries to be neutral, and then circles back to how that's impossible, and then underscores that again. And then, of course, he ends it with, albeit briefly, laying out the transcendental argument. And that was a point I really wanted to work on, because it was kind of at the end of his opening statement. And of course, it's time. You don't have all the time in the world. So he didn't really go into the transcendental argument itself as much as he went through the methodology and the philosophical background of neutrality. And so, see, that's one of the examples of this, why this book is so great, is because when you get to that point, it stops. And then we embellish upon what that transcendental argument is. And then it goes on to the next part of the debate. So he structured it very well with laying out what's happening psychologically, philosophically, with neutrality, and then closing with the transcendental argument.
Yeah. He set up a very good framework for the discussion and the debate.
Yeah.
So kind of
Yeah.
telling and I like his opening also in his debate with Edward Tabash, where he talks about, you guys watching this debate is like kind of coming into the middle of a movie, after it's been playing for a little while. There's a backstory. So I think he does a good job creating the context for the debate, highlighting the non-neutrality principle. This has been so fundamental for me, is this idea of the myth of neutrality. And we kind of get mocked for this because we always talk about it. But in my interactions, it literally lays at the heart of everything. I mean, the unbeliever, as a default, he just thinks it's the default position that we have to be neutral.
Yeah.
And so is that something that you have found in your own interactions with unbelievers? And maybe you can give an example of the sorts of things that unbelievers say that seem to assume neutrality.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, it seems common sense. Like, can't be biased. Let's start with a clean slate.
Right.
No biases, no presuppositions, and then we go to the evidence. And the first problem with that is it's fallacious, because to say, okay, let's not start with any biases and assumptions is itself an assumption.
Right.
So you're starting with a bias. And so that's the fallacy that John Locke succumbed to with this tabula rasa view of a clean slate, and then we go to the evidence. So it's fallacious to even think you can be neutral, because that very assumption means you're not being neutral in the first place. And then the second point really is, because it's so ingrained that when we go to the evidence, we have to be neutral. When you point out that that's impossible with philosophical matters, fundamental matters, it doesn't click. There's just this aversion, like, no, that's dumb. We can't be biased. And then you just show the unbeliever it's impossible not to be biased when it comes to fundamental matters. And then I point out to them like trivial things, like I said earlier, the rain. You go on your balcony with your buddy and you look at the clouds and you say, yeah, it's going to rain in an hour. And he says, no, it's not. That's different. You could kind of go to that issue with a clean slate. But
Sure.
when it comes to fundamental matters, it's impossible. You have to pick one side or the other side. You're going to sit at Dr. Bonson's table, or you're going to sit at Dr. Stein's table. There's no middle ground there.
Right.
So it's just, the comments you get, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Well, it's kind of that with neutrality. They never get it. It's the same thing. You can't be biased. You can't be biased. You are biased.
I remember listening to a debate with the atheist Aaron Ra. Are you familiar with Aaron Ra?
Yeah,
well, I remember my favorite quote was, "I've got no presuppositions, and you can take that to the bank." I was like, that check will bounce quicker than you can. What do you do when someone says, "I have no presuppositions"? How would you respond to someone like that?
It's self-refuting, because an easier way or more practical way of saying it is, I have no fundamental assumptions. And that's just all there is to it. But that itself is a fundamental assumption.
Right.
So it's impossible. It just keeps going back to the same point. It's impossible.
Wait, it's common sense, bro. I just start with common sense, dude. The snakes don't talk, dude. That's,
Yeah. And donkeys and all that stuff in the Bible, it's like, no, it's like, sorry, you're going to be biased one way or the other.
Right.
So if Dr. Bonson said, okay, I can't be biased, I'm just going to start with a clean slate, he didn't go from his table to standing in the middle. He went from his table to Dr. Stein's table.
Right.
And then it started from an agnostic viewpoint to get somewhere else. So it's one or the other. And it's just eventually, hopefully, it'll click with the unbeliever. But because it's ingrained common sense, no biases, sometimes it's just telling them over and over and over again until hopefully it clicks.
Yeah. Now, with respect to Dr. Stein's opening statement, even when I was first listening to the debate, I was pretty much familiar with the theistic proofs of natural theology, like the cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral argument, all that kind of stuff, Pascal's wager. I was familiar with all those. And even back then, after listening to because Dr. Stein prepared for a debate that wasn't happening. I mean, he was debating something completely different, right? He wasn't debating, a William Lane Craig or something like that. But even if he was, I think Dr. Craig with his classical approach would have destroyed him. I think, what do you think about Gordon Stein's attempt to refute the traditional proofs? Like, I thought they were bad. I think he was trying to be too ambitious. I think he went through like a 10 or 11 proofs. And so he'd really, you can't really, if we disagree with the cosmological argument or the teleological argument, I'm not sure you can adequately dismiss it or refute it in like a few passing sentences. If you're going to really give respect to the depth and history of such arguments that have been argued by intellectual juggernauts throughout history. How do you think he did with those? And maybe you can give an example of something fallacious he utilized when trying to refute some of those arguments.
Yeah, again, you have a certain limited amount of time with an opening statement. But because he laid out 11 different proofs that weren't transcendental, it seems as if his point was just to undermine the rationality of Christianity
Mm.
rather than to focus on Bonson's argument and refute or rebut it. And of course, he never mentioned it in his opening statement. And from that point on, he lost. But it seems like he just tried to undermine it. One of the arguments was the moral argument where, well, if you're a Christian, you'd expect all of these Christians to be moral, but if you look at the statistics of in prisons, it's disproportionately Christian. He never cites the study on that or anything, but
Mhm.
it's like, King David murdered someone to cover up a sin, and he was the king. He wasn't just some Israelite. And the Bible says he was still a man after God's own heart. And so it's like that conclusion doesn't follow. Well, you're a Christian, okay, well, you won't do this and you won't do this, you won't do this anymore. But it's just a failure of exegesis because you see clearly and then his son Solomon, all the wives and concubines, like, well, what's going on here? But yeah, so it's a lot of it is just trying to undermine the Christian theistic worldview holistically and commit fallacies throughout all the arguments, and that would take a lot of time to
Yeah.
go through. But
Yeah.
obviously, in the book, it's all laid out. And
Sure.
at the end of his opening statement, before we get to the next chapter, I had a paragraph that said the only blessing about Dr. Stein going through every other argument except the transcendental argument was to show the default or the faults, the shortcomings of all of the historic arguments, because there's commentary on how the cosmological argument falls short, the ontological argument. So there was a benefit to him
Well,
addressing every other
yeah,
argument.
I guess if there are weaknesses in the arguments, I'm not sure that he pointed them out sufficiently.
No,
The
no,
version of the cosmological argument that he refuted was a version of the cosmological argument I've literally never have heard in any public debate. Everything
yeah,
that exists has a cause. Well, if everything that exists has a cause, then God must have a cause. And so I don't hear anyone arguing those. So it seemed like that was a lot of straw manning the traditional arguments. And maybe my classical apologists are going to be watching this like, yeah, defend the traditional arguments.
Well, I would, like the premise there was changed. I mean, it may have originally been everything that exists had to have a cause, but then realizing how that can't apply to God, the premise was altered to everything that begins to
Mhm.
exist as a cause, and so God obviously wouldn't have a
Yeah,
cause. And there's another fallacy in equating God with the universe with man and bringing him down to the same level when you just can't do that. He's God and we're man, and so you can't compare the two and have them on the same plane and then judge logically if it's rational or not. So, and
right.
even in the cosmological argument point, I cite the objective proof from Christianity, and I actually helped Dr. Stein quoting Bonson, showing the fallacies in the cosmological argument, even
Mhm.
giving it the benefit of the doubt. So even
Okay.
some of his arguments, I show, yeah, I mean, this historic apologetic fails here and here and here. So I help him out in a sense, but ultimately it just wasn't conducive because he didn't address the transcendental argument.
Sure, sure. Now, what I thought wasn't the ultimate beast mode or kind of the gangster mode of Dr. Bonson is you're about to be cooked when Dr. Bonson starts speaking in third person. Dr. Stein, did Dr. Bonson ever mention just like he's like completely owning him. It made him feel so small. He's like, you mentioned 11 proofs that I don't use, nor do I ever defend. Did Dr. Bonson talking? He just the way he talks. That's what I appreciate about that is that Dr. Bonson had an air of authority to how he spoke, and just from a purely rhetorical perspective, it's a very useful thing. Not to be arrogant or smug or anything along those lines, but to really have a command over what you're saying, where you're going in your argument. I thought that came across very,
Yeah.
very strongly in this debate. And atheists have done it too. Someone like a Matt Dillahunty, I think his arguments are terrible, but he does have an air of authority to how he speaks, and that actually does serve him well in many of his interactions with Christians and theists and things like that. So there's something to that, but obviously you want
Yeah.
to match that with actual content and argumentation. Now, the
Yeah.
classical moment of the debate was the cross examination. Can you give us kind of a snippet of the sorts of things you make comments on with respect to the cross examination, especially with that classical moment
Yeah.
with the whole thing with the laws of logic being something other than God that is immaterial?
Yeah. And so Dr. Bonson pushes Dr. Stein because Dr. Stein's a materialist, and he kind of flip flops between what are the laws of logic, and he goes from this material explanation, like they're conventional, it's what society says, and then at the end of Bonson cross-examining him, he says, "Are the laws of logic immaterial or material?" And Dr. Stein says, "Well, how can a law of logic be material?" And Dr. Bonson says, "Well, that's the question I'm going to ask you." And Stein says, "I would say no." So then he concedes, well, laws of logic are not material. And then up comes Stein. Dr. Bonson, can you give an example of anything other than God that's immaterial? Like just pushing him on this immaterial, material aspect. And Dr. Stein goes, "Yeah, laws of logic. You just said it."
Right.
You just
Yeah.
completely forgot. And the audience erupts with laughter and applause. And it's one of the greatest zinger moments, gotcha moments in
Yeah.
religious debate history.
What I love about this debate is that it's unapologetically Christian in the defense of the faith. And it was not trying so hard to go out of one's way to prove a generic deity. In other words, we tend to see apologists concede so much to the unbeliever, but Dr. Bonson concedes absolutely nothing. And it just reminded me of that quote from let's see here. I got the quote up here by John Calvin, and it's an opening line in Dr. Bonson's presuppositional state. John Calvin says, and it's in his commentary on First Peter, he says, "Contentious disputes arise from the fact that many think less honorably than they ought of the greatness of divine wisdom and are carried away by profane audacity." And as you know, Joshua, he's actually talking about Christians who don't think highly enough of divine wisdom. And what I saw in that debate was not an attempt to be so apologetic about the Bible. Well, we can't use the Bible because, well, that we're just going to assume it's just a normal historical work. These sorts of things that we hear a lot from our classical and evidential brothers. And he kind of just stood on the word of God when he was asked the question about mathematics. He says, "Mathematics theistic?" And he's like, "Yes." And then he corrects himself. Dr. Bonson does. He goes, "Christian theistic." And I was like, the gangster glasses like zoomed in and went on to, that video, like a Tupac song started playing in the background.
The chain around the
neck. But he was so like he wanted
unwavering.
What was that? It was unwavering, and I just loved it. He was like, "It's theistic," and he's like, "Christian theistic." And I was like, that's gangster. What are some other moments in the debate that really stood out to you that you offer some commentary on in the book?
Because Dr. Stein was not prepared and came more from a scientific background, not so much a philosophical background, because his thesis was something in like the quail or biological biology or something. So he came from a scientific background. And over again, he's trying to justify the uniformity of nature, and that he says, quote, and literally a quote, "It's an inherent property of matter." And over again in that book, I keep commentating, or my commentary is, yes, of course, but that's the very thing in question. Why? That's the philosopher's question, is why. It's not so much a scientific question.
Well, but the great Richard Dawkins said, in science, we no longer ask questions. Why is such a silly question? You ever hear him say that? Yeah. Why is a silly question?
It's like, no, it's not. Like,
was that a good impression of Richard Dawkins?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. You didn't get not the accent. You didn't get the accent part.
Yeah, my bad.
Yeah, go through a little British accent, but so it's just over and over again going back to the uniformity of nature and induction. It's an inherent property of matter, and my commentary is my own, and I can draw from Bonson's commentary. That's the very thing in question. Why? And you could say, well, that's a silly question. Well, no, it's not, because it's just a question of curiosity, if you will. Mm-hmm. That question has to be answered. Why is it an inherent property of matter? Because if you just say, well, it just is that way, you're being arbitrary. You're just leaving it out there. In which case I can say, okay, God exists and it just is that way.
Right.
And the debate's over. I win. And it's like, no, that's being arbitrary. Let's give rational justifications or reasons. So that was one of my favorite parts, is I got to keep harping on him.
Yeah.
And not insulting him, but sure. It just a lot of opportunities to show the transcendental need. What is the precondition or the necessary explanation for why nature is uniform, why matter is inherently uniform?
Yeah.
And so that's the transcendental part, is the necessary precondition or explanation for that is that God upholds the universe. And we cite Genesis 8, I believe it's 8, when he tells Noah, seed time and harvest will continue day and night and so forth.
22.
So yeah, 8:22. So it's a good example of it's one transcendental, the uniformity of nature, but it's a good example of when you keep coming back to it, it'll eventually click. It didn't for Dr. Stein, but
Right.
hopefully for the reader and for the person listening, that's one example of a transcendental and the transcendental apologetic. The necessary precondition for why nature is uniform is because God upholds it. On the atheistic worldview, you just have to say it just is that way, which is to be arbitrary, which is to be irrational, which proves the Bible that God has made foolish the wisdom of this world. They cannot give an answer
Yeah.
to that issue.
I think sometimes people will mask the arbitrary nature of it by just asserting brute fact. That sounds philosophical. Scientists assert, philosophers assert brute factuality, so on and so forth. Brute factuality is arbitrary. You're admitting that there is no justification for the thing in question. And how do you know it's a brute fact? I mean, you make the claim, right? It's a brute fact. Okay, God's a brute fact. We're not getting anywhere that way. So I do see attempts to mask arbitrariness with philosophical jargon. One person told me, well, you guys believe in brute factuality as well. God is a brute fact. And of course, we would say that God is not a brute fact. A lot of people don't know this, but a brute fact is a fact that has no external or internal justification. There is no reason internally or external as to why the thing is. It's completely unexplained. And God is not a brute fact because by definition, God has an explanation for his existence. And the explanation for his existence is not external to him, but it is internal to him. God exists out of the necessity of his own nature. You can't say that as a brute fact because to offer an explanation for a brute fact would make it no longer a brute fact.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
It's a say, right? It's his self-existence.
Yes.
That's the explanation. He's God and we are not, and he necessarily exists and necessarily exists eternally because of his deity. That's his very nature. And so, the buck stops somewhere, of course. And for the atheist, it's brute factuality, which is arbitrary. For the Christian, it's God who is absolute and the definitive end all.
Yes.
And we don't say, well, that's just brute fact because we can explain it through his nature, his being, his deity.
That's what makes it not a brute fact. There is an explanation for why he exists in the way that he exists. And of course, we don't just assert that as a foundation. We argue for it transcendentally. And so there's an attempt to justify it, not simply to make the claim, although contrary to popular opinion, people think we're just making assertions because they don't understand argument. But anyway, all right. What about the do you address in the book at all the question and answer period? Sometimes there's some really interesting things and debates that come out in questions and answers. Sometimes not, but do you guys cover that as well? Because I have the book in digital form. I haven't gotten that far to the end.
Are you talking about? You're not talking about cross-examination. You're talking about Q&A from the
Q&A.
audience?
So, like at the end, when the debate's over and they go through questions after the debate, do you address any of that in his answers in that?
I have the book right here. I probably should have shown it earlier, but this is the book.
I was like, I wonder why he's not showing it. I need to get a physical copy. I have the digital copy.
It's really nice. It's like 250, 260 pages, but I'm looking here. The debate itself is 145. So, it's not the majority of the book itself because it's a debate, it's limited. It's not a class where you can make it as long as you want.
Right.
But yeah, I can go through all of these. This is the Q&A and all that stuff.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, I got to get myself a physical copy.
Yeah. And the commentary is littered throughout. There is not a single part of the book where there is no commentary in the body itself. And in the appendix that is from me, it's Bonson doing the opening statement, hypothetical rebuttal that fleshes out the transcendental argument. But the Q&A is solely me. But that comes from everything I've learned from him. So you could say it's original from him. But the entire debate itself, that body, there's commentary everywhere. Every single opening statement, cross-examination, rebuttal, Q&A, it's all in there.
Yeah. Now, I often hear a lot of people say, and Dr. Bonson addresses this in his lectures on transcendental arguments. People say, well, transcendental arguments are not accepted and taken seriously in the philosophical literature today. What is the primary reason why most philosophers don't hold to the legitimacy of transcendental arguments? And why shouldn't we care when we as presuppositionalists are utilizing, because to be perfectly honest, I don't care what quote unquote philosophers hold to. If they reject the transcendental argument, then they better have a good reason for rejecting it. And the
Yeah.
reasons that I've heard offered are not convincing to me. And
No.
every time someone appeals to kind of the Barry Stroud's work and the the substitution thesis and all that kind of stuff, I don't think it touches Van Til's line of transcendental reasoning and argumentation. So I'm not bothered by the stuff out there at all. So why shouldn't we be concerned? And why don't philosophers typically hold to transcendental arguments, or at least certain kinds of transcendental arguments?
So I would say the local question of why philosophers reject it broadly is because from the 20th century onward, everything became analytic, which is to say everything became really minute. We're going to focus on subsections of epistemology or ethics or metaphysics. We're going to get into the nitty gritty of it, And transcendental arguments are the complete opposite. They are broad. They are sweeping considerations. And so, of course, that's a complete contrary view. And so, expectedly, the analytic philosopher is going to say, well, that's illegitimate. We can't make broad, sweeping claims because we are fallible, we're finite, we're temporal. So, there's no way we can justify the broad issues. So, let's just get into the minute issues and get really analytic. So, that's the local consideration.
So if I could just cut in real quick, would you say
Yeah.
that the transition from the more continental broad type of philosophy to the analytic tradition of philosophy is due to the fact of philosophers' inability to answer the big questions that the broader continental philosophy was asking?
Ultimately, yeah, and
Okay.
it's not just a yes, because there are many parts and nuances to how the history of that was laid out. But after Kantian idealism in the 18th century, and then Hegelianism idealism in the 19th century, where everything is just so abstract and broad, it's almost as if by the 1900 1910s, philosophers just put their hands up and said, okay, you know what, this is all proven fruitless in past centuries, so let's just focus on subsections and get really analytic and ignore all the broad issues. And so when a transcendentalist comes along and says, well, I'm going to argue for the broad issues, it's like they gasp, like, what? You have the audacity to do
Yeah.
that.
I
But
think that's the reason why a lot of people who use presuppositionalism, at least in the more rigorous way than kind of the lay person, right? When they're talking to the atheist who has some knowledge in philosophy, it seems like they're talking past each other because many
yeah,
atheists today, online and in the literature, are are reflecting their exposure to analytic kind of philosophy, and the
yeah,
presuppositionalist is coming along talking in more broader categories that the analytic philosopher is not really used to. So there's a lot of
yeah.
talking past each other.
A perfect example of this is like David Paulman. A long time ago, he's since blocked me, and I don't say that in a degrading way. I think we butted heads a little too much.
Sure.
But a perfect example of an analytic approach is, well, what kind of epistemology should we hold to? What kind of theory of knowledge should we be? Foundationalist? Should we hold to a coherence theory, a pragmatic theory? And so David, for example, even though he's a Christian, he's getting into that analytic approach. You have to be a foundationalist. Coherence theory doesn't work. Pragmatism doesn't work. But the presuppositionalist, the transcendentalist says, I'm not talking about that. I'm asking the question, what has to be true in order to even talk about epistemology? How do you even get to what is the precondition by which we can even debate these analytical issues here, here, and here?
Mm.
Because we have to be conscious. The universe has to be predictable, uniform, and so forth. And so we're just asking the broad issues or claims. Why are we conscious? Why is nature uniform? Why are there laws of logic? How is it that my 3-pound brain tissue can be interactive with these abstract universal laws of logic? And so analytic philosophers, atheists want to say, well, that sounds foundationalist. And that's, I don't hold to foundationalism, but it's like, I'm not talking about that. I'm asking, how is it that we can even debate to begin with about foundationalism? How, we have to be conscious and so forth, laws of logic. That's the question I'm asking. And so, as you said, there's a talking past each other here. And because of this, again, it's ingrained, this being very analytic, just like neutrality, you can't really, it doesn't click.
Sure.
So there's always that talking past each other, and you have to take the unbeliever's hand or the opponent's hand and walk him along and say, look at the broad issues. You have to take him to a cliff and look at all of this. That's what I'm asking. I'm not looking at the grass over here or the rocks over here. I'm looking at the whole view. What has to be true? What has to be the case? What are the transcendentals? the explanations for why we can even be philosophically analytic to begin with.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciate about Dr. Bonson is that he acted as a philosophical bridge between the continental broad strokes of the philosophical tradition of Van Til and the
Yes.
analytic philosophical tradition, as Dr. Bonson was an analytic philosopher himself.
Yeah.
So it's really cool to see someone who is an analytic philosopher trained by a continental philosopher and then linking. It sounds like a bad joke. A
I
continental
know.
philosopher walks into a bar with an analytic philosopher.
Yeah, right.
You know?
No, it's like a parody. It's a walking paradox. Like you have this analytic philosopher arguing continentally. It's like, and he
Yes.
did it perfectly, but
But
it's
he did
like
it
that
with
doesn't
more
make
precision and clarity
yeah,
than
yeah,
Van Til, and I think that's specifically because of his training in analytic philosophy.
yeah,
So
yeah. I agree.
yeah,
I agree.
well, very good. So this book I highly recommend folks pick up. Get a double if you haven't picked up the other one, Objective Proof for Christianity. Get that one and get the Great Debate. Readings and analysis. I highly recommend it. I have to get myself a physical copy.
Yeah,
That looks so much.
it's packed.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Good stuff.
So
And Joshua, I always appreciate Joshua coming on the show, and he's him and I are very like-minded in that we have dived deeply into the work of Bonson, and I very much appreciate a lot of his insights that I don't catch when I'm listening to the lectures and things like that. So I greatly appreciate you coming on and expounding on things and doing some teaching. So thank you so much for all the work you put in.
well, thank you for having me. It's great. Want this book to be out. It's a blessing from Gary and the American, vision, despite all the behind the scenes controversies there.
Sure,
But
sure.
point is, the point is that these books are getting a biblical apologetic out and to equip and train Christians the appreciation, as John Calvin said, of divine wisdom, being
Mm.
unwavering to Christ, who is the foundation of all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So it's really just getting this book out to give. It's really a theological example and lesson. This is how you do apologetics.
Yeah.
Here's the book. Read it, and be faithful to the mandate of 1 Peter 3:15. So
Excellent. Well, if folks want to pick up that book, they can pick it up at AmericanVision.org. And you could order it digitally there.
yeah,
I think they give you like a PDF if that's your it's very weird. I read a lot through Speechify because I'm always on the move. But I'm like,
yeah,
I'm not gonna use Speechify because then I just listen to the debate. But I
yeah,
guess I
yeah.
could listen. That'd be so weird. It's like I'm gonna get the PDF and I'm gonna put it into my text to speech, and then I'm like, wait a second.
It's the same thing.
This
Just
sounds familiar. Yeah,
but
but
I should mention before I forget that there were legal issues there were back and forth letters with Bonson and Stein in the
mm,
following year with the debate, and Dr. Stein was bringing up the same points, and it went for I think a little over a year back and forth letters between Bonson and Stein
yeah,
about various issues pertaining to the transcendental argument, and Dr. Stein threatened legal action, litigation, if Bonson released the letters because I think he knew deep down he was just getting fried, he was getting cooked. It just, he wasn't getting it. So he got defensive and said, "These letters aren't going out. I will sue you."
mm.
And so Gary talked with Roger Wagner uh, as this book was being,
Just for folks who don't know, Roger Wagner was Greg Bonson's best friend, so there's a
yeah.
connection there. Yeah,
So he talked with Roger because it'd be great to have these letters out. We've never seen them before. They've been hidden for 40 years. And it's a great announcement to say that we have excerpts of Bonson's letters in this book that have never been revealed before. And the only reason we can do that is because there's no legal issue, of course, with releasing Bonson's letters because he was open to having them publicized, however that may be. So excerpts of Dr. Stein's letters are not in there, except for when Bonson quotes a sentence or something from one of his letters. So it's really exciting that there are over, I think, 30 commentary, 30 footnotes from those letters that have never been seen before, ever. And it's just more incisiveness from Bonson's philosophical and apologetic
sure.
just activity. So,
Excellent. Well, guys, pick it up and enjoy. And the best part is once you read the material, put it into use. Don't be the
yes.
guy or the gal where you read apologetics, you consume content on YouTube, and don't actually share and defend the gospel in the public square and in the particular context that God has placed you in. So I want to encourage you guys, the best kind of biblical apologetic is one that is grounded, obviously, in the Bible, but also is being utilized as we seek to declare the kingship of Jesus Christ to the world. So thank you, Joshua, so much for joining me. It is always a pleasure. And if you guys like what Joshua has to say, if you look at the backlog of my channel, he's been on a bunch of times, sometimes with other guests, sometimes just him. So if I remember, I'll try to remember to put links to past interviews that we've done in the description of this video. So thank you, Joshua. Guys, thank you so much for listening in. Until next time, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.